Grief and mourning are universal concepts across human societies, but how grief is experienced or expressed is quite varied. Your reading for this week does a good job of presenting several aspects of grief by drawing in some specific examples, and it also focuses on a few theories of grief that go beyond the traditional psychological approaches. When we talk about grief and mourning, what we're talking about are the emotional responses to death that include both personal and social dynamics. Traditionally, grief has been a part of personal, family, and community life, but now it's seen as a much more technical and medicalized experience. Davies seeks to highlight both the force of emotion surrounding death and the way people's social worlds influence their responses. Most of us are unprepared for bereavement when we first experience it. Because of that, the idea of getting back to normal is similar to the idea of getting well again after a mild illness, and your discussion for this week touches on this sort of topic. In this case, our social worlds are more likely to return to a sense of normalcy than the sort of inner experience that we're having throughout a period of mourning and grief. I'm going to include in your additional materials for this week a link to an article from the online journal Sapiens. It talks about a case in Cameroon. There was a video that went viral of a body snatching case, actually, from a local hospital. In this particular case, it was a man in his 70s, and he died after a several-day stay in a hospital where he was brought for treatment from a stroke. The staff told the family that he died from coronavirus because the doctors claimed that the stroke was actually caused by COVID-19, but the family didn't believe that. This cause of death, however, required that he be buried in a local cemetery, but that was against the family's wishes. They wanted to take him to their ancestral village to be buried according to their traditional funeral practices. This is just one example of how COVID-19 and other infectious diseases are causing issues like this across many different cultures. So what can be done differently? Misinformation and mistrust of health officials are rampant, so public health officials must find ways of balancing local knowledge, ancestral burial customs, and global health protocols in a more culturally sensitive way. I recommend taking a look at the article. It's an interesting discussion and, of course, very relevant to what we're still experiencing here today. The chapter for this week talks a bit about the concept of performing grief. Not all grief looks the same, and even within the same culture or society, external versus internal expressions of grief can be quite different. We save our tears for when we're not around other people in some cases, or there are certain people where it's okay to let that emotion be shown. And these are all culturally determined sorts of behaviors. We often have a hard time dealing with what we see as being unexpected or unfamiliar responses to death. And this isn't just necessarily in death, but any kind of social situation. Emotion, however, is one aspect of life that all cultures deal with. They all experience emotion, but it's treated in very different ways. As a very quick example, you can think of the stoic, Englishman versus a very effervescent Italian and using all their expressive hand motions, and you can imagine in your head the stereotypes that go along with that. Feelings in this case are embodied thoughts. The textbook talks a bit about the concept of a person as a container that fills with emotions and that needs to be emptied every once in a while. And I think we can all maybe relate to that. I know I can. As one extreme example in the book, Davies talks about the New Zealand Maori. This is when there's a death that occurs within a community. It's a time of potential danger. There are high levels of taboo, things that are, not good to be around, and bad juju you don't want to engage with. Because of that, the house of the deceased is typically burnt. The corpse is dressed, their kinfolk, they keep watch over it. There's this sort of moaning sound that's constantly going on within the area where the funeral is taking place. Some relatives end up cutting themselves, and to an extreme, the textbook quotes someone as talking about the kinsfolk weeping copiously to the point that mucus would run out of their noses. Their grief had to be totally unrestrained. Just you lose absolute, complete control in this case. There are other cases, however, where people might have a more difficult time expressing that emotion, and because of that, there are actually people out there who are professional mourners. Let's take a look at a few examples.
Some people don't know how to cry. Some people, when they lost their relatives, they don't know how to talk and cry. My name is Amidokli. I'm a funeral contractor. People came in to pick me to go to their funeral and cry for them. We are all widows. After our husbands died, so we decided to come together to help those who cannot cry. So if we are not there, it will not go on well with them. Some funerals are big funerals. Some are normal. So whenever you invited us and we come in and we notice how big the funeral is how we charge. It's a normal thing. We will all die one day.
At Orgosolo in Sardinia, a young policeman was killed in a fight with bandits. He was 20 years old, born and raised here in the village. Perhaps for the bandits it was a planned killing, because even today, in their eyes, a Sardinian on the side of the law is a traitor. He was buried on Thursday morning, but throughout Tuesday and Wednesday, his body remained in the home of his mother. On Wednesday night, the best professional mourners came. For the more important dead, they travel all the way from Oliena, Fone, and Urzulei. They applied themselves so strenuously to their lamenting and weeping that at midnight they could be heard for miles. Then at 4 o'clock in the morning, the women from Urzulei changed places with those from Oliena, who had to return to their own town for another task. They were needed in the home of Domenico Pidu, whose wife had died the night before.
All right, so just a few examples of what these professional mourners look and sound like. It's also a common practice
Some people don't know how to cry.
in East Asian cultures as well. Okay. Your textbook talks about grief in Greece as another one of these case studies. Talks about a 5-year period that occurs between the burial of a corpse and its exhumation. This is seen as a time for adjusting to the idea of your dead loved one. The exhumation itself is marked by intense emotion, but also tends to bring the period of grief to a close. So what we see in these photos to the right is obviously the empty burial. The bones have been gone and taken out and are placed into a small box that is stored within what's called an ossuary, where people can still continue to come and mourn, to feel the bones, touch the bones, engage with their loved ones in a different way. The textbook also talks about this concept of an indigenous theory of catharsis, so catharsis being the way that you get over dealing with something. This can involve repeatedly talking about death, which finally rids people of this sort of intense emotion, the pain and anguish that you feel immediately upon death. It's important for the grief-stricken to work through some of their emotions, but the system really never returns to normal. There's a link here to a news article as well talking about some of the other factors actually that contribute to this Greek practice of exhuming deceased relatives due to, population pressure in terms of cemeteries themselves, also not having enough money maybe to rent out a plot of land in perpetuity. This starts to get us the concept of what's called time is a healer, or time heals all wounds. These are the sorts of phrases you might hear when it comes to grief and mourning periods. There's one study that's talked about that looks at how long it took people to return to normal in their own mind. 45% said, within days. 23% of those interviewed talked about weeks. 18% were in the time frame of months, whereas there was still 15% of the population interviewed that were talking about a time scale at the length of years. What this reflects actually is the closeness between the mourner and the deceased. Davies talks about one study in particular that looks at the adaptation after bereavement as it varies across different kinship relations. In this case, 35% of the mothers showed no sign of decreased attachment to their dead child after 14 months. Fathers often appear less troubled in these situations, possibly due to the need to support their wife, but they often show their strain months later because they've had to just kind of delay and push their feelings down while they help their wife to overcome the tragedy. The study found that widowers adapt much less well than widows to the loss of a spouse. It talked about how sisters are considered to be this forgotten group. They often receive less support than the surviving spouse or children of their brother. And lastly, adult children are the least troubled group, especially sons, when it comes to the death of their parents. One topic that gets a lot of attention in the book as well, and is an important one to consider here, is that motherhood and the loss of a child. Some mothers never actually recover from the death of a child, and this is based on the model of bereavement as an illness, as something that needs to be overcome, but in most cases that's not really what actually ends up happening. The study by Jane Robinson looked at perinatal deaths and the effects on mothers. This dealt with the fact that stillborn births are classified as abortions in some cases, and that can actually have a very severe impact on the mother, how she's treated, as well as the child being considered, a non-person in that sort of regard. The quote that you see here is directly from our textbook. It gets at the point of the legality behind how, at birth, the baby is designated as either, being a stillborn birth versus abortion has an effect on how the remains themselves are treated, and therefore you can assume has an impact on the feelings of the mother and how she's treated within the hospital and how she can mourn for her dead child. A woman is transformed into a mother through the experience of conceiving, carrying, birthing, and nurturing their child into adulthood. But in these cases, a mother is a mother because she has a child. When she no longer has a child, her identity is actually radically altered. While death ends someone else's life, the memory of that person still forms part of the life and identity of the living. An important point that I actually hadn't even occurred to me until reading the textbook was that spouses become widows or widowers, children who lose their parents become orphans, but we actually have no word in the English language for parents who lose their child. There's no term that we apply to these people and use to refer to them. In this sense, it's a very different and severe sort of occurrence. One of the quotes in your textbook mentions the loss of a child is like amputation. Parental bereavement is a permanent condition. So you, in this sense, you never recover, you never get over that sort of loss. And so through these examples, what Davies is trying to get at is the combined biological and cultural dimensions of grief, and how that produces in people, what that produces for people, how it changes them, how they are changed through the experience of bereavement itself. In this sense, it's wrong to interpret grief, as an illness, because that implies that recovery returns someone to a normal state. And even if you can function at a normal level, relatively normal level, there's still going to be occurrences that come back and bring all that grief to the surface again, and that's outside your control. Rituals of bereavement in and of themselves produce a different kind of person. Going back to some of the theories we talked about a few weeks ago in terms of death. Funeral rites constitute a rite of passage in the sense that Van Gennep defines it, by shifting an individual from one social status to another. You were a wife, now you're a widow. They also need to be viewed, though, in Bloch's terms, as a process of rebounding conquest, through which a personal change occurs because of what has been encountered. So you are never that same person again because of what you've experienced. When it comes down to specific theories then about grief, from a psychological perspective, we commonly hear about and see what are described as stage theories of grief. These are immensely popular in contemporary societies, but are actually problematic due to the oversimplification and assumed universality that is inherent in these sorts of models. Stage theories, they create an image of fixed levels through which someone must pass, and the stages can actually be confused with different symptoms, the feelings or behaviors that you're experiencing as you move through this period of mourning. When in actuality, in reality, what it might feel like or how it might be experienced is more similar to this image here on the right. You might be bouncing around through all different sorts of emotions, and there's no one set fixed path through which you must pass to move on, to get over the death of a loved one. These sorts of theories come out of a book written by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on death and dying. Within it, she accounts the experiences of 200 terminally ill people in Chicago. By interviewing these people, their loved ones, she actually identifies what she defines as 5 stages, the same ones that you see in the figure here: denial and isolation, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. These phases, these stages are identified as certain coping mechanisms. How do you encounter and deal with what you're feeling at that particular time? These coping mechanisms may last for different periods of time, will replace each other, or exist at times side by side. So right there in the definition of how these stages were determined, we're already seeing that there's no universality within the actual experience of it. All right, and finally, Davies spends quite a bit of time talking about this concept of dividuality and embodiment. He was particularly inspired by the work of McKim Marriott, whose recognition of the need to approach Hindu culture through the notion of a person not as an individual, but as what's called a dividual. In Western cultures, we view people as individuals, that is, as self-contained and, despite our connections with others, remaining firmly bounded and almost insular creatures. This concept of dividuality then expands the notion of a person to include the pervasive nature of social and natural environments engaging with and flowing into and out of a person. It also helps to highlight the notion of embodiment and material basis of human and social life. The concept of dividuality means that there is no clear separation between an individual and society. There is a flow out of a person and into others and into the surrounding world at large. Thus, the dividual person is a more dynamic and interactive entity than the individual. Our interplay with the world around us matters a great deal in making us who we are and also making it what it is. To help wrap our minds around this very abstract sort of concept, Davies talks about a common phrase, "you are what you eat," as a simplified way of conceptualizing someone as dividual. What is taken into our body affects it and becomes a part of it and changes us ultimately in the end. A final element of this concept is Catherine Brown's paper on the memory of the flesh, in which she discusses how people can see their own actions, that is, the things they say or do, as reflections of their deceased parents. Such occurrences allow us to see or feel them not only in our activity, but as our activity. In this sense, we aren't talking strictly of a memory, but of a kind of shared embodiment. We become them, and they become us, and through that, they stay with us forever.